Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hi everybody, Tom Woods here. It is episode 2526 of The Tom Woods Show, and I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Yesterday I mentioned that it was my birthday, and so this still being my birthday week, I decided I would take one day off during my birthday week. So rather than have no third Tom Woods episode, I decided instead to reach back into the old archive to an appearance of mine all the way back in 2011 and bring that to you and see what you think about it. This was an appearance I made at a Lincoln Reagan Day dinner in Montana. C-SPAN actually covered my talk. I was the keynote speaker at this event, and it was a big deal. Like, the governor was there, the U.S. senators from Montana were there, Congress, every important person was there. And so as you're hearing what I'm saying in what follows, realize that all those people were listening. I'm told some of them were squirming, but, you know, look, that's what I'm here for, right? I mean, what would be the point of all this if I held back and pulled punches in a situation like that? So my book Rollback had just come out, so my gosh, it's like a lifetime ago. But I think you'll find the information in here interesting and provocative. And yeah, you know, it's not, the audio is not as good as you're hearing right now, but it's plenty good for you to appreciate and understand it. So I hope you like it, and I will be back with regular episodes next week. And I want to remind you that I am doing murder mystery dinner parties coming right up in Charleston, South Carolina, in Boston, in New Orleans, and in Dallas, Texas, with more to come. And you should go to one of these. If you're watching me right now or listening to me right now, and you like the Tom Woods Show, and I'm bringing a murder mystery party to your town, and you're not going, I don't know what's going on there. Okay, so you can get all the details about them. They are a blast. You don't need to do any prep. You don't need any background. You will have it completely explained to you the night of the event, exactly what to do. It's easy. It's fun. The website is woodsmystery.com. So go to woodsmystery.com. And if I didn't mention your city, go to woodsmystery.com anyway and sign up to be notified when I add more cities to my list. So having said that, I hope you enjoy what is about to hit you. Here we go.
What I'm going to talk about tonight is a myth. It's a multifaceted myth. It's a myth we all were taught, we all imbibed in the 6th grade. And I think even the best of us, in our heart of hearts, still cling to some portion of this myth. And that myth runs something like this: that government is composed of wise, selfless public servants, innocently pursuing the common good. And that were it not for these people, where would we be? Well, we'd be helpless, wandering boobs. We'd have no art in our society. Every artist would put down his paintbrush if it were not for Joe Biden. We'd have no science. We'd all be ignoramuses. All our limbs would be blown off by exploding consumer products. Our kids would be working in a mine for $1 a day. And the economy would be run by short men with white mustaches running around carrying sacks of money with dollar signs on. Now, didn't we all kind of get this, right? We all got that. And that story is superficially plausible. I understand why people believe it. I'm not arguing that people are stupid for believing this. What else would people believe? This is what we're fed all the time. Now, if I were running a racket like the government in Washington, this is precisely what I would want you poor souls to think. That sure, you got to fork over a lot of your money to me, and you may not like it, but gosh, think of where you'd be without me. It'd be so terrible and unthinkable. It'd be a law of the jungle, a dog eat dog, and so, you got to just grin and bear it. That's exactly what I would want you to think. But now let's suppose for a minute, let's suppose for the sake of argument, that instead of being educated in government-funded schools, which most Americans are, suppose what would happen if people were educated in schools funded by Walmart. And every day, the kids went into their Walmart-funded school, and up on the wall, they saw all the CEOs of Walmart over the years, and they were taught to sing songs to the CEOs of Walmart, and They were taught how indispensable these people are. All the progress we've seen in civilization is due to these people on the wall. And every year, they wait incense in front of the Walmart CEO's images. And every year, there's a special day the kids get off from school so they can go home and meditate on the greatness of the Walmart CEOs and where would we all be without them. Now, if that were the case, wouldn't we say, man, this is kind of creepy? I mean, maybe there were some decent Walmart CEOs, but I'd rather think that we would have gotten by all right, without this sort of arrangement. But as soon as it's U.S. presidents up on the wall, well, we believe the whole package. Oh, where would we be without President so-and-so? We'd all be dead in a ditch somewhere with no limbs. And people would be ground up into sausages and everything. This is what we got, and we get this day in and day out. And I'm basically making it like my life's work to repeal this whole way of thinking. Basically, that's what rollback is about. It's not really a book about cutting the budget, although that is part of it. But what I'm saying is it's not enough to cut the budget, as hard as that would be. What we really need to cut out is the propaganda that yields us a budget like this, that leads the people to believe they'd be helpless and impoverished, it'd be terrible if the government never cut back. Well, that's why we can't make any progress, because everyone's trained to think this way. That's the root of the problem. That's where we need to go. It's an educational issue. Now, having said that, I do want to say a little something about the picture that we face. And of course, behind me here, we've got the usdebtclock.org website, which is pretty depressing, of course, but I believe there is, if not an open bar, at least a cash bar, so drown our sorrows later. But having said this, I do want to talk about just some specifics about what's going on here. Because if we reject this idea of government, we reject this idea of our helplessness and all that, then perhaps the fiscal crisis we're facing is an opportunity to be embraced rather than a calamity to be deplored. I mean, maybe the outcome of this will be the restoration of some kind of free society. And yes, there is going to have to be some substantial change. They can't keep kicking this particular can down the road. I mean, even in the best scenario, assuming we have a robust recovery from our current malaise and interest rates stay super low, even with these heroic assumptions, the government's own figures tell us that by 2020, the U.S. government will be paying nearly $1 trillion a year just in interest payments on the national debt. That is the best scenario, and I rather doubt we're going to see the best scenario. And incidentally, I say this not as someone who's always pessimistic and, the glass is always half empty to me. I'm just looking at the figures, and these are figures that would not be disputed by anyone. It's not like people would come along and say, now, wait a minute, Woods is misleading you because the real figure is X, and he's saying it's Y. There is no disputing this. This is based on sources which are easily consulted. We have the problem of the entitlement programs. The unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare are greater than twice the GDP of the whole world. That's a teensy-weensy bit of a problem, I would say. And yet, the best they can come up with in Washington, like we're arguing over a $38 billion cut, which turns out to be phony baloney anyway. As I said before, this is like taking 10 cents off a trip to the moon. And that's the boldest of what we're seeing, or more or less the boldest. All right, so what can we do? I mean, we've got an aging population, we've got a demographic crisis that's about to hit. It's funny, by the way, we've been talking about healthcare a little bit tonight, and we sometimes hear on the left, oh, we should imitate the great European systems, which are all doing so well. But it's interesting to know that when you speak to the finance ministers of these countries, which I'll confess to you, I haven't done that personally, but I know of people who have, they more or less confess that the demographic, the aging of the populations of those countries is just going to be a tsunami for those. It's going to completely destroy those systems. They all know that. They're not idiots. They should just act like them on TV. But they know that. But their view is that the finance minister, will be safely retired by the time that happens. So, I mean, this is going to be hitting everyone. So what are we going to do? What could we do about it? Could we tax our way out of it? Well, let's leave aside the moral issue involved in taxation and just the practicality of it. A little-known statistic that we have seen since the Korean War is that, tax rates have gone up and tax rates have gone down. But regardless, the federal government has rarely been able to get from the private sector much more than 20% of GDP in terms of revenue from the taxpayers. So it's true, they could squeeze out perhaps a little bit more than they are now, but not nearly enough to solve this problem. That's the point. There seems to be an upper bound for various reasons beyond which the federal government simply cannot confiscate. Okay, we could borrow our way out, because I think maybe there'll be a lot of countries that say, gosh, we got trillions burning holes in our pockets. Let's go invest it in almost 0% return U.S. government debt. That sounds like a way to go. Well, obviously the terrible, horrific catastrophes that have befallen Japan suggest that Japan's by and large going to be a net liquidator of U.S. debt. China's got its own demographic problems coming up, largely self-inflicted because of its one-child policy. It's going to want to also spend money on its own industrialization. So, these are problems. There aren't going to be enough suckers in the world. And then finally, they could print the money. But as I explained earlier, my 7-year-old already kind of sees through that. Which goes to show, I thought a panel of 7-year-olds would be almost better than the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve Board put together. At the state level, things aren't much better. There's somewhat, how could they be worse, really? But we've got a lot of states on the verge of bankruptcy. We've got 7 states where their pension program is going to go bust in 2020, another 13 states by 2025. And that assumes, by the way, they get an 8% annual return, which there's a slight chance that might not happen. My favorite indicator, there are problems. Last year, the governor of New York at the time seriously considered a plan to bail out the pension funds by borrowing from the pension fund. You have hit a dead end at that point. It's not just us who think there's something a little bit fishy about this. Or the classic example, look at what happened to Detroit. There's your classic case of the left liberals got everything they wanted in Detroit. They got the taxes, they got the regulatory structure, they got the spending, everything in their wildest dreams they could have asked for. And what happened in Detroit? General collapse occurred. And it never occurred to any of the architects of that disaster that a general collapse was possible. They just assumed that, there'll always be more suckers to expropriate next year to keep the thing going. Things will be, 2 or 3% different next year. That'll be it. Never occurred to them that the thing could come crashing down. Since 1950, half the population has fled. And in recent years, a quarter of the schools are closing. The home prices tell the story, though. In 2003, the median home price in Detroit was $98,000. By 2009, that was down to $13,000. You think, wow, they hit rock bottom there. No, last year it was $7,000. Now, it's true, you read an occasional article about this, a brief news item, but in proportion to the scale of the collapse, the likes of which we have not seen in American urban history, this story went unreported. Now, meanwhile, what's happening to the young generation? Well, good thing they're all playing video games and getting drunk, or we'd have a revolution on our hands. Actually, let me reverse that. I wish we did have a revolution on our hands, of course. But look at what they're facing. I mean, these poor kids, a poll last year found that 85% of graduating seniors from college are saying they're moving back in with their parents because they have no idea what to do other than that. So we have that problem. We have the fact that these kids, when they do get jobs, are going to have to work harder and longer just to stand still, all in order to prop up a system that everyone in this room knows is going to collapse anyway. That's just unjust. That's fundamentally unjust. I don't care what your philosophical position is. There's no way you can defend that system. And so the data that I'm referring to here, there's much, much more besides, you can find in Chapter 1 of Rollback, and in fact, my publisher put Chapter 1 up at, I've got it up at tomwoods.com. What I want to spend the rest of my time talking about, though, is not just these dreary numbers. Again, what I want to talk about is this ideology of dependence, this ideology of helplessness that's been drilled into us to make us these pathetic little nobodies who feel like, well, where would we be if it weren't for Bob Dole and Joe Biden? And no! This is unworthy of a free people for us to think this way. So I want to just go through some of these typical arguments that we get.
Hey, everybody. One of the great things the COVID lockdowns and restrictions took from us was the unforgettable annual event that economist Bob Murphy and I hosted from 2016 to 2019, the Contra Cruise. Well, Bob prefers to stay on land at the moment, but with his blessing, I am announcing the Tom Woods Cruise. Remember from the Tom Woods Show, Clifton Duncan, the Broadway actor who paid a devastating professional price for declining the COVID shots, but who's now creating a one-man show on the life and ideas of Thomas Sowell? Well, he's joining us too, and we'll get to hear his stunning singing voice that I bet you didn't even know he had. The first 50 people to sign up can join me on a special excursion on Roatan, Honduras, to a free private city there of the kind the ambitious Free Cities movement has been promoting and that I've discussed on the Tom Woods Show. It's the closest thing to Ancapistan in our world today. Each of the first 50 people will also join me for dinner one night during the week. We're also going to put on the biggest murder mystery party I've ever held. And I have other great special guests joining us, including Scott Horton, as well as Paul Counts, who directs my mastermind programs, so all you business folks will have a chance to pick his brain during the week. We depart from Galveston, Texas on February 23rd, 2025, and return 1 week later on March 2nd. Make sure you're one of the first 50, and I'll see you on board. The website is tomwoodscruise.com.
Where we would be without our wise overlords. So, for example, poverty. Well, poverty would surely get worse if it weren't for our wise overlords. I mean, they're the ones who have brought about the great conquest of poverty that we've seen over the past 200 years. Well, to the contrary. Since 1820, 85% of the world's population lived in what economists call absolute poverty. By 1950, that was down to 50%. By the early 1980s, down to about a third. And by 2001, it was down to 18%. So that meant that between 1981 and 2001, for the first time in history, in a 2-decade period, we've seen both the percentage and the absolute number of people living in absolute poverty fall. We've never seen anything like this in history. Now, is it a coincidence that we see this kind of progress against poverty at a time when free market economics, albeit not to the extent we would like, has begun to spread around the world? Well, in Rollback, I'm explaining what the logical connection is. It's not just a coincidence. It makes absolute sense. This is what we should be led to expect, that the market economy would lead to fantastic outcomes like this. In the developing countries, we've seen rising life expectancy and caloric intake and so on. Now, what about in the U.S.? Well, in the U.S., we're not using the absolute poverty metric. We're using a less desperate U.S. poverty metric. But in 1900, about 95% of the population lived in what today we would consider poverty. By the late 1960s, that was down to about 12 to 14%, and that's where it has stagnated ever since. Now, note, Lyndon Johnson is the one who got the war on poverty started. The funding for those programs really got started in the late 60s. So notice that with hardly any anti-poverty programs to speak of, poverty goes down amazingly in the U.S., and then the government programs step in, and then it stagnates. Now imagine if those numbers were reversed. Let's imagine we had Lyndon Johnson in 1900, and he gave us the war on poverty programs. And then for nearly 7 decades, we had progress against poverty, and then the mean old Republicans got rid of those programs, and then poverty stagnated. I mean, can we just predict what they would say? Well, of course this goes to show these programs are wonderful, and we need them, and where would we be without them? But when reality is exactly the opposite, what do we hear? Crickets. Nothing. No acknowledgement of this at all. Now, by the way, how come in the year 1200 nobody protested poverty? Was that because everybody was living in fantastic wealth in the year 1200? It's because nobody thought poverty could possibly be conquered. Nobody thought that you could possibly, basically what people took for granted was you're born into this world into squalid conditions. You're going to live your life basically one bad harvest away from starvation, and then you're going to die. And there's nothing you can do about this. But it's because of the wealth that the market economy made possible that it suddenly occurred to us, maybe we can abolish this. Or at the very least, of course, we will always have the poor with us, but we can seriously alleviate this suffering. Never occurred to anybody before. And in fact, now we live at a material level that it's like out of a science fiction novel. When we consider that even in late modern Europe. I mean, for heaven's sake, even the greatest monarchs of the 18th century didn't have flush toilets. They didn't have central heating, plumbing, whatever. All these sorts of things we take for granted. Even they had servants. That's true. But the difference between a rich man and a poor man 300 years ago is that the rich man rode in a coach of 4, and the poor man walked in bare feet. Today, the difference between a rich man and a poor man is that the rich man has a fancy car, and the poor man has a beat-up car. But they both have cars. That means there is less inequality than before. In fact, what's very, very interesting? Remember that book, The Grace of Wrath by John Steinbeck? The Soviet government showed the movie version of that in the 1930s as a propaganda vehicle to show how terrible the capitalist West is. Look at how poor everybody is. But it backfired on them because the Soviet population watched that movie and couldn't believe the people had cars. Now today, look at this device I have, okay? This smartphone. I can talk to, picture in picture, I can talk to some guy with his face on the screen, in Munich. Right now, if I want to, walking down the hall while I'm doing 3 other things. The Jetsons didn't predict that. In the Jetsons, you actually had to sit in a special chair, and there's a screen there you have to look at. Even the Jetsons couldn't imagine the world. We take this for granted, like, any social system could yield this. No, it isn't. It isn't any. It's a system that respects private property and the rule of law, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, there is, as I say, as I show in the book, there is a causal mechanism between the free market and this type of prosperity and this conquest of poverty, and yet there's no credit given to the private sector for this, basically. You read that 6th grade textbook and you think, the private sector is where all the wicked exploiters are, and thank heavens we have the people in the public sector. I suggest that's rather not the case. So it's not enough, though, that the government sector will take credit for advances that are due to the private sector. They will then blame the private sector for things the government did. And I give one, this might sound like a boring example, but it actually isn't. I remember being in grad school in the 90s, and we were hearing about what happened in California. There were rolling blackouts in California, supposedly because of energy deregulation. And boy, this goes to show you crazy capitalist ideologues that we need our overlords in charge of energy, or we're going to have blackouts and da-da-da-da-da. Okay. Well, first of all, what deregulation are they talking about? It's true. Wholesale prices of electricity, which were paid by states' electric power distributors, they could fluctuate. But the retail prices were fixed. And moreover, it was extremely difficult because of the regulatory barriers to bring new power plants online, and some of them were actually taken offline. And so this is at a time when demand is surging. You've got the voracious demands of the computer industry in California, you've got a growing population, so you've got surging demand, and the private sector isn't allowed to respond to that demand. The result is blackouts, and this is blamed on the free market. That's like out of a George Orwell novel. But we're used to that. Like every day, it's like another page in George Orwell. Really, the poor guy should be getting royalties for what the New York Times publishes. Right? The New York Times doesn't realize that was a dystopia that he was writing about. He wasn't giving us a model to live by. Now, I also talk a little bit about, but I'm going to spare you folks this, the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s. That's supposedly another case of the free market run amok and da-da-da-da. But that was a case of an institution husbanded by the government, given an impossible business model when we have an atmosphere of rising interest rates and double-digit inflation. And then they try to ease up the situation on the S&L so that they can get out of that impossible spot, but they keep insuring their deposits, and then they're surprised when they make reckless investments, and then that's blamed on the free market. Even though there's the government guarantee behind it. Now, what I do want to talk about, though, is the classic case of government blaming everyone but itself for a failing, and that's the most recent financial crisis. Now, the left typically says that those of us in this room are engaged in special pleading when we try to pin the blame for what we just endured on the government and or on the Federal Reserve, and that if only we weren't wearing our laissez-faire blinders, we would see clearly that this is a failure of capitalism and so on and so forth. All right, well, I talk a little bit about this in my book Meltdown, which was like my second bestseller, New York Times bestseller 2 years ago. There's a free chapter of that also at tomwoods.com. But I elaborate a bit on this in Rollback 2. But in Meltdown, I talk a lot about the role of the Federal Reserve and keeping interest rates super low. Interest rates, and you think, oh, interest rates, this can't possibly be interesting. No. Interest rates turn out to be like the most interesting thing in the world because they play a coordinating function in the economy. You can't just intervene in the economy and say, I think interest rates should be even lower, so let's just do it, and I bet there will be no consequences. No, Hayek, F.A. Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974, parentheses, I realize the Nobel Prize has been a bit poisoned in recent years. But Hayek's win of the Nobel Prize means something because he won it for saying the exact opposite of what the Nobel Committee wanted him to say. But he was arguing that this is the root of the boom-bust cycles, that you interfere artificially with interest rates, sets the economy on a kind of sugar high that it crashes from. But Hayek said interest rates are supposed to act as a brake. They're supposed to be a brake on our ambitions. They're supposed to say, no, you are setting the economy on an unsustainable path. We don't have the physical resources to complete all the projects we've embarked on, so stop doing it. But we didn't have any brakes starting in 2001. Thanks to Alan Greenspan, we had no red lights. Everything was green. Oh, sure, you have 5 investment properties with interest-only mortgages and no job. That seems like a sensible thing. And a lot of people did. And people thought that was it. All I have to do to get rich is buy a house and sit there. And I automatically become wealthy. And people, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And this seemed sensible, and this was encouraged by the authorities. In 2001, we're just coming off that dot-com collapse. And Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve System, former saxophone player, has decided, nothing against saxophone players, but it's just so odd in one person, based on, and he even said this, well, I have this feeling in the pit of my stomach that maybe the federal funds rate should come down by 25 basis points. I mean, it was that creepy. In fact, the New Republic had this author, Stephen Glass, maybe you remember in the early 90s. He used to break the most interesting stories. Well, so to speak, Stephen Glass, sorry about that pun. He used to break the most interesting stories because he made them up. It turned out later. People found out. Like other reporters thinking, how did he break this story? I never found out. Because he invented the stories, which you could do more easily before the internet. But one story he made up was that some investors on Wall Street had built a little shrine to Alan Greenspan with flowers and candles and stuff, and they would meet together and meditate from it. He didn't get caught on that story. People heard that story and thought, yeah, that seems like a sensible thing somebody might do. I mean, this was the madness that overtook the country, but particularly during the housing thing. During 2001, Greenspan lowers interest rates 11 times. So that's the only recession on record in which housing starts went up. So what conclusion do people naturally draw? Well, I got to put my money in housing because apparently housing is robust through thick and thin. Best investment you can make. Flipping houses is the best thing you can do. I mean, all of this, and then Greenspan says you should take out adjustable rate mortgages, and the housing market is fine, and then his successor says the housing market is fine, there's no bubble. Lending standards are robust, said Ben Bernanke. Lending standards are robust. And this guy is supposed to be one of the major regulators of the banking system. Lending standards are robust. So, the Fed might have played a teensy-weensy role in this, is what I suggest. But then we're told, but deregulation did, right? Deregulation, you think, okay, I got the C-SPAN audience, you don't want to go into a technical thing like this, but I don't want to go into technical things. Well, no, I got them right where I want them. Why make them change the channel if they think it's going to be boring? But it's not. We got to know this. This is the version of the narrative that we are getting from Washington. We have to be prepared for it. We've got to be able to answer this in our sleep. All right, so what was deregulation? It's just some sinister word. It just kind of suggests like sinister characters skulking, around and, up to no good. So what does it mean? Well, all right, what basically happened with deregulation? Well, over the years, the major planks of it were getting rid of Regulation Q, which put a cap on the level of interest rates that you could charge on a savings account or pay on a savings account. Okay, well, that was like the early 80s. It's not going to cause a worldwide catastrophe 3 decades later, presumably. We had in the early 90s restrictions on interstate branch banking lifted. Well, from my vantage point, that makes the system more stable because now a particular banking system is not so subject to local state-based swings one way or another. They can be diversified with holdings and depositors across the country. But then the one we hear the most, though, that supposedly caused the problem is the alleged repeal of something called Glass-Steagall. And we get this all the time. Now, the reason they mention this is because this is the only act of deregulation that is even remotely plausibly connected at all to the financial crisis. So they all harp on it. And then it was a little tricky for them when they realized that Bill Clinton signed that and Joe Biden supported it. So the villain story doesn't quite work. Then you have to paint the horns onto Biden's head and Clinton's head, which is fine with me, but it doesn't work for their story. So what exactly happened with that? What was actually going on with that? Well, just to make this very quick, but I got more details in the book. But by and large, basically what happened was this. In 1933, you got this thing, the Glass-Steagall Act, and it was supposed to separate commercial and investment banking. And that just meant that if you're a commercial bank, you can't underwrite or deal in securities. You can buy them if you think they're going to be a good investment for you. You can sell them if you no longer think they're a good investment, or you just need cash, but you can't be a broker, basically. You can't deal in these things. And investment banks can't take deposits. And moreover, there can't be the same parent company that controls both a commercial bank and an investment bank. So it separates these two types of banking. Now, in Europe, they never had this restriction, and they never had any problems as a result of it. So the only part of this that was lifted in 1999 was that last provision, that an investment bank and a commercial bank can't be controlled by the same holding company. That was lifted. Now they could be. That was it. That's the big thing that brought the entire world to its knees, supposedly. Well, it turns out that when you look at the data, this clearly has nothing to do with it, for a variety of reasons, just one of which is that standalone investment banks and standalone commercial banks also blew up and did badly, just as much as ones that happen to be connected. There's no clear connection, and as I said, there's much more evidence with regard to this. And then you look at the sheer size of them, there's no way a commercial bank could possibly bring down an investment bank and so on. So by and large, the Obama administration began to abandon this version of the story, to its credit, I will say. Instead of saying deregulation caused it, because I suggest there is no repealed regulation that would have prevented this crisis. The banks were always allowed to securitize mortgages. They were always allowed to acquire them and add them to the portfolio. They were always allowed to do this. It wasn't like deregulation made this possible. Well, anyway, I want to just move on to some other aspects of things. But that Glass-Steagall thing is a complete red herring. It is a complete red herring. And then beyond that, we get it must be we didn't spend enough on the regulatory agencies. It's always this narrative that if only our overlords had the power to crack a few more skulls, then we would there is no problem that they couldn't have addressed if they had more authority. But in real terms, adjusting for inflation, spending on the regulatory agencies in charge of the financial sector tripled since 1980. Did not get cut under George W. Bush. Here they blame it on George W. Bush. He must have cut it. Well, I don't know what George W. Bush cut, but certainly wasn't these things. They were not cut. And if Lawrence Kovalkoff at Boston University counts 115 federal agencies in charge of regulating the financial sector, you'll forgive my skepticism of the proposition that if only we'd had 116, then we would have seen this thing come. Because remember, the regulators we did have told us everything was fine. So what do we do? Hire more of these bozos? I mean, these are the people. Remember, if you graduated from business school at the top of your class, you're going to go on and run a business. If you graduate at the bottom of the class, you're going to become a government regulator, basically. So, you're not, they're going to run rings around you. So the model we're supposed to go with is, well, these regulators who have no financial stake in the outcome, they'll keep an eye on everything. But why? Why should we expect them? Why should we not expect them to be as totally clueless as they showed themselves to be during this current crisis? They were relying, first of all, on the risk assessments of a small cartel of government-approved rating agencies. And beyond that, they either grossly misread the condition of the housing market or just misled the public. I mean, remember, Greenspan is saying the housing market was encouraging, and Bernanke's saying all these crazy things. But even if they had been able to perceive the problem, what are the chances they would do anything about it?
Hey, everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you are getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you are a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. Or what if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking, meeting places getting shut down? Use your website as a lead generation engine. Or what if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO's expert search engine optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help.
It would be extremely politically costly to do anything about this particular one. And I quote here the economist Arnold Kling, who says a regulatory crackdown would have meant taking away a punch bowl filled with more home ownership, particularly among minorities, as well as expansion and profits in the businesses of home building, real estate brokerage, mortgage origination, and Wall Street financial engineering. Well, that's just not going to happen. And then also, we had this so-called prudential regulation to keep the banks from doing crazy things. And so they had these regulations that said the safer the assets you're holding, the less you have to keep in reserve as capital. So the way it worked was for every $100 you've got in standard loans, you've got to keep $10 in capital. For every $100 you have in mortgages, you have to keep only $5 in capital. And for every $100 you have in AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities, you have to keep only $2 in capital. So take a wild guess at which asset class everybody and his uncle fled into, right? Everybody goes into this. So then the thing collapses, and now it's all the worse. Because this type of regulatory apparatus almost mandates herd behavior. Instead of a normal situation where people would have been diversified into a variety of asset classes, everybody's in this. And then we're told, okay, but didn't we have poor management of major financial institutions? Well, no doubt about that. That's why you need to have failure. You have to allow them to fail. The same bozos don't keep doing the same thing. You got to read David Stockman on that, the former Reagan budget director, on the myth of TARP. You know, we all would have gone to a black hole, never be heard from again, if it weren't for this and all that. He makes mincemeat of that. You can Google TARP and Stockman. But okay, so we got this bad leadership. But what we don't hear about is that the current regulatory environment makes it very difficult to do anything about the bad leadership. So insurance companies, pension funds, mutual funds, and banks are simply not allowed to hold more than a very small stake in a particular company. Hedge funds and private equity investors are restricted by regulations that prevent them from acquiring a controlling interest in a bank holding company. But these are the institutions that have a stake in keeping an eye on management and keeping wayward management in line. We're supposed to sit back and hope that regulators who have zero stake in this, they're going to get their salary no matter what. They might get a raise if they don't perceive any time. It's because they would be deprived of a good salary. We've got to pay them more. Maybe that's not the most promising model. But because of this government policy, stockholders of these institutions are artificially disorganized and scattered, and management enjoys artificial protection that it would not enjoy on a free market. Okay, now a further point about this myth of government is that it causes us to lose our imagination. We begin to think, once government does something, we can't think of any way it could be done otherwise. And this is why, Murray Rothbard used to say, imagine if the government produced and distributed shoes. And then somebody proposed, well, why don't we privatize shoe production? We would never hear the end of this. What? Well, I mean, people have all different sized feet. How would we ever provide for that? Maybe a private company would produce only left foot shoes. I mean, we think of the most convoluted, ridiculous. I mean, it's incredible how little dignity we allow ourselves to have. How helpless we think we'd be. Why would a company produce only left-handed left foot shoes? Why? They have no interest in doing that. Why would they want to do that? But it's the same sort of thing. You propose privatizing something, people immediately resist. No, we couldn't live without this government funding. So, for example, if you're against government funding for the arts, this makes you an opponent of the arts, period, apparently. So we think there would be no arts without government funding. You terrible Philistine, you want to cut government funding. And yet, okay, well, look at it. Look at the National Endowment for the Arts, okay? What do they get, a couple of $100 million? But private donations to the arts amount into billions of dollars. So, like, we, in our own activities, have already refuted this myth. We just don't know. And incidentally, I live in Kansas, and the governor, Sam Brownback, is trying to eliminate the Kansas Arts Council, or whatever it's called, and try to encourage private investors to, donors to fill the gap. And my wife and I once went to a theater in rural Kansas, the Columbian Theater, and we got this email. I'm on their list, and they were panicked. They said, "This is terrible. Brownback is going to take our money away. Do you know every year we get $5,000 from the state?" So they have become so pathetic. They have so little creativity, so little imagination. They think they couldn't have a bake sale and raise the $5,000. I'll give you the $5,000. If I knew that was the difference between you and closing your door, I'll give you the $5,000. $5,000. I mean, that's like one, jogathon thing. You get whatever, a raffle. I mean, this is pathetic that we think this way. But I want to take on a harder case. Okay, enough of this easy stuff like poverty in the arts and regulation. Let's take on science, right? If it weren't for, and then, so of course, all the left-wing hate sites as soon as this airs. You can just imagine what Media Matters, which always goes after me. They can't actually answer anything I'm saying, by the way. And my biography is at tomwoods.com, which they never link to, because then you might see, well, he's got some credentials. Can't do that. So all the thought control sites will go after me. Crazy Neanderthal is against government science money. Well, okay, but look, I actually have arguments for this, and I'm going to share them with you now. And it's basically this. Let's take, for example, Britain in the 19th century. Britain was the most wealthy, industrialized country in the world, home to some of its most illustrious scientists. And you know how much government science funding there was? Zero. Meanwhile, France and Germany spent boatloads on science through the government and fell way behind. Now, let's again do a thought experiment. Suppose it were reversed. Suppose Britain had spent all the money and then did very well. And France and Germany had spent nothing and then did badly. We would never hear the end of it. Aha, it goes to show the difference between good science and no science at all is government funding. But when the opposite, when once again, as usual, reality defies what the statists tell us, we just hear silence. It just never comes up. People don't even know about it. Japan's civil research and development is the most privatized in the world. And yet Japan engages in an enormous amount of what's called basic science, which supposedly the free market would never provide. Basic science, because it doesn't yield immediate profits and fruits of it could just be stolen by a competitor, so why would the free market ever provide it? But it does. It takes place in Japan in industrial laboratories instead of in tax-funded universities. We have bought into this false notion of science, I think ever since Francis Bacon, centuries ago, that scientific progress supposedly runs like this. We have basic science, scientists just sort of working in a laboratory. And that gives rise to discoveries, which then in turn are adopted by private entities, which put them in the service of human welfare. Now that is a plausible story. I believe that for a long time. But that's actually not how science has in fact progressed. What normally happens, in fact, is that applied science builds on applied science, not on basic science. Classic example of this is the steam engine. The steam engine did not emerge from scientists in lab coats. It wasn't that some guy was in a lab somewhere experimenting, and all of a sudden he said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I got a steam engine over here." This is not the case. It was practical men adapting pre-existing technology to modern problems. In fact, the science had to adapt to the technology because the steam engine was actually more efficient than existing science said it could be. So the science had to change. The Department of Defense years ago looked into how many of the 700 key research breakthroughs that led to the development of important weapon systems were attributable to basic science. And the answer was 2 out of the 700. So applied science built over on applied science. But the point is that even basic science is supplied more by the free market than it is by governments. If you look at percentage of GDP, it's no contest. Private donors way outspent governments in the age before the estate tax decimated incomes. And Terence Keeley explains this in his great book, the economic laws of scientific research. It's unfortunately very hard to find that book. I summarized it a bit in my own here. And then, moreover, I mean, we could just go on. There's a lot more evidence and rationales of why we should expect this to be the case. In fact, he makes a very cogent argument that government funding will always displace more than it replaces. So there will be less overall spending on science. And this is very counterintuitive. But as I say, and I give more support to it in the course of the book. Now let's take on a couple more toughies here. I want to say, now obviously I can't take on the whole regulatory apparatus. I mean, this like requires a whole revolution in our thinking. But what I do just want to do is just raise some ideas for reflection. Just throw out some facts that a lot of people just don't perhaps know. It's not to say that we don't need any oversight of various things. It's just what form does that oversight take? And what sort of agency in our society engages in? But take, for example, OSHA, occupational safety and health. Well, what would be the typical narrative about that? Well, before OSHA, everybody's dying on the job because, people are standing on the assembly line and it's so unsafe that they're falling into the grinder and then, we're eating hot dogs made out of a guy's leg. I mean, we get that constantly. We got that in the Upton Sinclair book and all that, okay? But in fact, first of all, 60% of the injuries on the job are nothing that an employer could do anything about. Like 20% of them are like violence on the job, like people beating each other up. Well, I mean, once that happens, it's already going on. Not much you can do about it. And then another 40%, and so adding up to the 60% is traffic fatalities, like during like you're on the highway or something. So these are not the classic things that we've been led to think of. We think about workplace fatalities. But we don't know this. People say, hey, look, we got OSHA, and then look what happens. Workplace fatalities decline, and injuries and so on. But the point is they were already declining at an even faster rate before we got that thing. Now, that's not to say, maybe OSHA accelerated it or whatever. Well, again, okay, we talk a little bit more about that in the book, but the point is, I bet most people didn't even realize that progress is already being made because the wealthier the society becomes, the more desirable and possible it becomes to bring about safer environments. That's just the natural part of the evolution of society. Or the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Surely this must be the reason that we're seeing there being fewer fatalities every year on the highways. 3.5% a year it's going down. But you know what? In the 35 years before we had that agency, at what rate fatalities were going down? 3.5% a year. And again, we don't hear anything. Not a word. This is entirely due to your wise overlords, and you'd all be dead without them, so shut your mouths. No, I'm just not buying it. And then also, there are countless examples of how the private sector, the bad part of the private sector, uses the regulatory apparatus to its own advantage to hurt its competitors. I mean, just think about, like, for example, anytime there's some industry where there's some government move to ban advertising in that industry, who's advocating that? The biggest established firms, of course. Doesn't hurt them. Everybody already knows about Marlboro. Nobody knows about Joe's Cigarette Company. Okay, kids, if you're watching, don't smoke. But you see my point, right? You see the logic of it is that we tend to think, gosh, what a wonderful public-spirited measure this is. Well, you know what? That's kind of rare, actually. It's usually, like, there's a reason that the most free market political candidates on the national level tend not to get a huge amount of money from big business. It tends to be the case. Because they kind of like the system the way it is now. They're perfectly happy with it the way it is now. So these regulatory bodies very often prop up the established firms, and meanwhile, we have gullible people who think, gosh, where would we be without them? So just one example of this. For a long time, we were told that we have to avoid cutthroat competition. And on that, and cutthroat competition just means like lowering prices for people. So that has to be treated as like the devil, like that's like Godzilla. We don't want that. And so in the name of doing this, every major innovation in retail over the past more than 100 years was fought tooth and nail by existing firms precisely on these grounds. Well, if we had this innovation, it would lead to cutthroat competition. No, it means I would have to get off my lazy you-know-what and work harder to compete with my competitor who's having a sale. So, for example, when we hear about, this is kind of dated these days, but we used to hear jokes about traveling salesmen. Poor traveling salesman. He was the butt of so many jokes. Talk about a misunderstood poor soul, the traveling salesman. Why did people make jokes about the traveling salesman? And I derived this from some work by Murray Rothbard. Well, okay, the traveling salesman was not liked by a lot of wholesalers because he could get into a town, visit every retailer, and show off his wares, and then get out and win their business. And of course, the established way of doing things doesn't like that. How dare you? Who does he think he is? So the established firms moved to get heavy licensing fees imposed on traveling salesmen, which they couldn't afford to pay. If I'm going to go into this town, I have to pay this fee. So what they would do is they would sneak into town, go to each retail store really quickly, hey, here's my stuff, and then get out before they could be detected. And so because they were operating sort of on the edges of legality, people began to think of them as being slightly underhanded and perverse, even though it seems more underhanded and perverse to make them do this, right? Of course, but as usual, wise overlords are guiltless, and it's the terrible, traveling salesmen that have to go out. Or department stores. My gosh, department stores were treated like the return of Godzilla when they were introduced. Department stores. How dare these institutions sell multiple products? And to add insult to injury, they're doing it on different floors. Who do these people think? And then mail order. Mail order? You're just going to send out a Sears Roebuck catalog and I've got my whole storefront here? And so people were encouraged to have large bonfires of the Sears Roebuck catalog, the great enemy of society. Or then it was, chain stores, but then it was the discount house. Now this is great. For a long time, there were rules in some of the states that a retailer cannot sell a product for less than the manufacturer's suggested retail price. Because if they did so, that would be cutthroat competition and da-da-da-da-da. Well, obviously, we all know who was pushing for this law. The retailers, obviously. It was not the general public saying, oh, I'm so sick and tired of sales. Could you please stop marking things down? Horrible. No, of course it was the retailers themselves. But by the 1950s, the heroic discount houses popped up, where they were going to offer you the low-priced goods, marking them off the manufacturer's suggested retail price in defiance of the law. And at first, people didn't know what to say. The establishment was all ruffled. Who are these people? These discount houses. You should read. I quoted rollback an article from Life magazine, horrified at the discount houses. Because at the discount houses, they're not waiting on you hand and foot. Like you don't go into them and say, why, I need a fan, please. Oh, yes, sir, I'll take you to the fan section. No. If you have a question, they'll answer it. But that was how they kept their prices low. And okay, so they didn't always sweep the aisles. So Life magazine is going, oh, they have unswept aisles, and people are rude in there. I mean, like they couldn't compute that this sort of thing. So a lot of times, these discount houses were hauled into court, injunctions were brought against them, you're going to stop doing this. But finally, it became impossible to deal with it. And so today we have this heroic situation where today we look at the manufacturer's suggested retail price, we think, what sucker is paying this thing? It's the heroic discount houses who stood up against this use of the apparatus of coercion and compulsion, namely the state, to benefit certain institutions at the expense of others. All right, well, let's see how I'm going to do it. Okay, I was told I still continue with my regular time, so I am going to take advantage of that. I will just say very quickly, I wanted to say a little bit more about it, but I'm going to truncate things a bit, that even when we get to something like like national defense, even here, there is reason for skepticism. And I say this as somebody who years ago I would have thought, if you say that the military budget should also be on the table, but when you're talking about budget cuts, well, you must, what kind of go back to Russia, you commie. That would have been my response. But then the more I've read about it, the more I think, well, wait a minute, now I feel like I'm being taken advantage of. Like now I feel like, my former patriotism is now being exploited by people, and that's just not right. And so, for example, there's a lot of military analysts who've been around the Pentagon for years say this, that we've got this problem of the missing $1 trillion over the past roughly like 9 or 10 years. Like since 9/11, the Pentagon budget went up by a couple $1 trillion, and half of that went to the wars. But the question is, what happened to the other half? That's what a lot of like Winslow Wheeler and a lot of people who are not left liberals at all, they're asking, where did the other $1 trillion go? And the reason they're asking that is that when you look at the state of things, like they see that the combat air fleet is weighed down by like 51%, when it's got I think down by 43%, got a 51% budget increase. How can that be? How can the number of battle force ships in the Navy be down by 15%? Or the Army is up trivially, but the Army's budget is up substantially. Like, how could this be? Where is the money going? And the institution is the one cabinet department that's not subject to audit. It's explicitly exempted from audit. So it's not to say that they failed the audit. It's that we don't even know. We don't know, have contractors been paid once, twice, or not at all? Nobody knows. We don't know this. But we're sort of told, well, you can't mention that because that means you hate America or something. No. I mean, I say this would be like the most important thing to look at. And then moreover, there have been economic consequences of all this. And one of the points I make is there are certain incentives that a private firm faces on the free market. Those incentives are, you've got to keep your costs low, and you've got to keep the quality of your product super high. But these are not always the incentives that firms are operating under when their client or their major client becomes the Pentagon, because although money is an issue, it's not like they could just spend like $1 quintillion on something, but they'll give the money one way or another. More concerned is how well can you work with the military community? How well can you deal with the fact that we may be changing the design on you very frequently? I mean, this is a much greater concern. So a number of scholars have noted that the business model of these firms becomes, instead of cost minimization, becomes cost and subsidy maximization. So that once they then go back to the private sector, they've almost forgotten how to be a competitive firm again. And an example of this is what happened to the U.S. machine tool industry, which was the envy of the world as recently as the 1960s. And then the Pentagon became its chief customer. And so we have first that a lot of the great research and development minds are being siphoned off into the government sector. And there's nobody replacing them. There's only a fixed number of geniuses. Some of them are doing this. They can't be doing R&D work. But also, the incentives they're operating under were very unhealthy. So that by the late 60s, the big thing was numerical controlled machine tool technology. And the Japanese developed it inexpensively. The Germans developed it inexpensively. The U.S. machine tool industry developed it, but so expensively that no private sector firm could buy it. And this has been suggested, this is because they're operating under a whole... Now, the Pentagon could buy it, and did, but they're operating under completely different incentives. I mean, these are issues that need to be considered. All this stuff has to be on the table. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is more than just about spending or balanced budgets or debt. Ultimately, it is about right and wrong. And here I want to close, but it's a long close, so I'm building up to something, okay? I want to close with a little story from Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick, the late Robert Nozick, was a Harvard philosopher who wrote a book in 1974, won a bunch of awards, called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And I want to read to you, well, these are going to be my words, but they're his ideas. I want to read to you his Tale of the Slave. And it goes through 9 statements, but they're very short. The Tale of the Slave runs like this. First, and he invites all of us to consider ourselves as the slave in the story. First stage, you are a slave at the mercy of a brutal master who forces you to work for his purposes and beats you arbitrarily. Second, the master decides to beat you only for breaking the rules and even grants you some free time. Third, you are part of a group of slaves subject to this master. He decides, on grounds acceptable to everyone, how goods should be allocated among you all. Fourth, the master requires his slaves to work only 3 days per week, granting them the other 4 days off. They can do as they wish during their free time. Fifth, the master now allows the slaves to work wherever they wish. His main caveat is that they must send him 3/7 of their wages, corresponding to the 3 days' worth of work they once had to do on his land every week. In an emergency, he can force them to do his bidding once again, and he retains the power to alter the fraction of their wages to which he lays claim. 6, the master grants all 10,000 of his slaves, except you, the right to vote. They can decide among themselves how much of their and your earnings to take and what outlets to fund with the money. They can decide what you are and are not allowed to do. We can suppose, for the sake of argument, that the master irrevocably grants this right to the 10,000 slaves. You now have 10,000 masters or a single 10,000-headed master. 7, you are granted the freedom to try to persuade the 10,000 to exercise their vast powers in a particular way. You still do not have the right to vote, but you can try to influence those who do. 8, the 10,000 grant you the right to vote, but only to break a tie. You write down your vote, and if a tie should occur, they open it and record it. No tie has ever occurred. 9th, you are granted the right to vote, but functionally, it simply means, as in the 8th stage, that in case of a tie, which has never occurred, your vote carries the issue. Nozick's question is this: at what stage between 1 and none did this become something other than the tale of a slave? Well, that's an interesting unexamined question, because it is an unexamined premise of our society across the American political spectrum, that society cannot function without a single coercive institution with the power to dispose of the lives and fortunes of over 300 million individuals. While throwing the poor a few scraps in 1,001 open and covert ways, this institution enriches various elites at the expense of the productive population. The more it grows, the worse it gets. More and more sectors of society conclude they too must enrich themselves by means of government-granted privilege. Everyone begins to clamor for subsidies just in order to break even. The industrialists take, the farmers take, the scientists take, the military establishment takes, the social workers take, the education bureaucracy takes, everybody takes. All of this looting under cover of law is what Frederick Bastiat, the great 19th century French economist, memorably called legal plunder. No one considers it legitimate to stick a gun in his neighbor's ribs and take his things. Yet we are taught to believe that a dramatic moral difference separates that kind of open stealing with the indirect kind. In other words, when the government sticks a gun in your neighbor's ribs and hands the proceeds to you. Nozick put it like this: when you tax away from someone the fruits of 5 months of his labor, you are in effect taking away 5 months from him. You are taking away part of his life. Dance around the issue all you like, but this is forced labor by any reasonable definition of the term. To be honest, when I said Harvard philosopher, you weren't expecting it to turn out quite as well. But can this really... Is it so unimaginable to conceive of a society in which we finally put the guns down and deal with each other on the basis of reason and compassion rather than force? Bastiat once described the state as the great fictitious entity by which everyone seeks to live at the expense of everyone else. Well, this arrangement is coming to an end. Something is going to have to give. We're facing fiscal collapse. We may be confronting a currency collapse in which the dollar's purchasing power will fall precipitously over the course of a short period of time. And then there won't be anything left for the poor or for the pressure groups or for anyone else except a bunch of worthless promises. And every year the crisis is not addressed, the situation becomes all the worse. So, in short, the propaganda with which we are flooded regarding how indispensable our wise overlords in Washington is, this is unworthy of a 6th grade. We would not die instantly were it not for the constant oversight of our overlords in Washington. We would flourish. And here's the proof. Thank you all very much.
All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that was worth your while. And before I sign off for the week, let me remind you that the event of the year is coming up before you know it. And of course, I'm talking about the event of 2025, and that is the Tom Woods Cruise. Those of you who recall the old Contra cruise I used to do with Bob Murphy, some of you said, oh, I'll go on that someday, and then we abruptly just discontinued the whole thing. And there went your opportunity, but it's back with the Tom Woods Cruise. We're going to have an absolute blast with some of your favorite Tom Woods Show guests. I'm going to have the biggest murder mystery party I've ever held and all kinds of other incredibly fun things. These events are absolutely unforgettable. So get the details as quickly as you can, because the sooner you sign up, because you get to pick out where your cabin is, the better choice you'll have. So the website is tomwoodscruise.com. I'll see you aboard, and thanks for listening, everybody.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.